The Oversight Investigation Subcommittee will come to order. The title of today's subcommittee hearing is Examining the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau's Mass Data Collection Program. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the subcommittee at any time. And without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. The chair now recognizes himself for 4 minutes to give an opening statement. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is fundamentally tasked with protecting Americans from unfair, deceptive, and abusive financial practices. Ironically, as a result of its massive data collection activities, the CFPB is putting all Americans, all of us, at risk. From January 2012 through July of 2014, the CFPB carried out 12 large-scale data collections, including the monthly collection of data affecting hundreds of millions of credit card accounts, 173 million mortgages, as well as information on 10.7 million consumer credit reports. 5 of these data collections are ongoing. Not a day goes by that Americans are not made aware of yet another breach of their sensitive information. Whether it's in the public or private sector, vast collections of personal consumer data are prime targets for cyber attackers. Aside from the fact that the CFPB does not need to be collecting this vast amount of information to carry out its regulatory mission, it's troubling that it has not taken more appropriate steps to secure this data. In fact, before this committee last year, CFPB Director Cordray said that he cannot rule out the potential for a data breach at the Bureau. We now know, and the American people don't know, how much personally identifiable information, or PII, the CFPB retains, how that data is protected, and what the Bureau plans to do with all of that data. And while the CFPB claims that it collects very little data that contains PII, collecting non-PII data may also endanger consumers. A recent study published by MIT-led team of researchers found that knowing just 4 pieces of information about a person's credit card transactions was enough to re-identify the anonymous credit card data in 90% of the cases that they studied. Dodd-Frank granted the CFPB expansive and intrusive authority with very little accountability or oversight. However, CFPB's data collection programs appear to exceed the mandates included in Dodd-Frank. Under the guise of its supervisory, monitoring, and examination authorities, the CFPB appears to have subordinated consumers' interests with its data collection programs. What is more concerning, while the CFPB claims to be an information-driven agency, it seems to cherry-pick data to justify pursuing a politicized rule-making agenda. From publishing unverified consumer complaints on its website to using unreliable methodologies for estimating race in auto lending ECOA actions, the agency has proven time and time again that it will present only the most convenient of, quote, facts for its purposes. Manipulating data to validate a regulatory outcome is not sound public policy. This is junk science. The CFPB should focus on responding to actual allegations of consumer fraud and discrimination rather than collecting data for the purposes of undertaking costly and abusive phishing expeditions. I welcome our panel here today of witnesses, and I look forward to hearing from them as they present their testimony. I now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, the ranking member, Mr. Green, 4 or 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank the witnesses for appearing, and I'd like to acknowledge the presence of the Honorable former Speaker of the House. And for our purposes today, because he was the Speaker, I shall refer to him as Mr. Speaker. I am, Mr. Chairman, antithetical to most of what you said, and I'm also concerned about something that has occurred. Mr. Speaker, someone owes you an apology. And someone owes you an apology because on the memos that I've received and on the witness list, you are acknowledged as the former Speaker of the House, and indeed you should be, but there is no acknowledgement of your affiliation with the U.S. Consumer Coalition. And generally speaking, this is what we do here. I have a document that I shall ask unanimous consent to be placed in the record.
Without objection.
This document is dated July 23rd, 2015, from the Financial Services Majority Staff, and it's to the members of the committee, styled Dodd-Frank Act 5 years later. And it indicates that we were having the Honorable Phil Graham to appear, indicates that he was a senior partner at U.S. Policy Metrics, and that he's a former United States Senator. Honorable R. Bradley Miller, of counsel with Grays and Ellsworth, LLP, and former member of Congress. So I'm going to ask unanimous consent that the record be corrected so that it will be indicated on the memo and the witness list that you are, Mr. Speaker, you are associated with the U.S. Consumer Coalition. I ask unanimous consent.
If that's the case, without objection.
I would also indicate why I've done this, Mr. Chairman. Perused quite a few articles concerning this coalition, this group. It appears to be a corporate-owned and subsidized synthetic grassroots organization. The activists, consumer organizations, know very little about it. It's a 501c4, no way to ascertain who really funds it. And I think it's very important for us to know who's really coming after the CFPB. And this organization has a mission statement that coincides with much of what has occurred here in the Congress of the United States of America. So I'm going to have to yield some time to the ranking member, but I think it's important for us to go into this. I have several articles that I'll be introducing in the record, and having perused the Speaker's statement for today, I'm going to assume that it's just an oversight, because nowhere in the statement does it indicate his affiliation with this U.S. Consumer Coalition. This oversight has occurred more than once because it appears that the Wall Street Journal had to issue an amplification as a result. This is something that has been called to our attention by virtue of various sources, one being Media Matters. So with this, I will now yield the remainder and residue of my time to the ranking member.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the time. As we sit here today to talk about the CFPB's data collection practices, the CFPB uses the data it collects to ensure that potentially harmful products do not permeate the market, to inform the agency's rulemaking efforts, to conduct critical supervisory oversight, and to return money to consumers that have been harmed. Unfortunately, my colleagues across the aisle are not here today to discuss data collection practices. Instead, this hearing is simply another blatant attempt to mischaracterize the Bureau's data collection activities as harmful to consumers. How do we know this? Because the chairman of this committee, Mr. Hinterland, previously sponsored the PATH Act, a bill that, if enacted, would have authorized the creation of a national mortgage data repository that would collect the same individualized, personalized data that Republicans shame the CFPB for collecting, and that is the subject of this very hearing. Currently, most of the data that the CFPB collects is public and non-personally identifiable. Both the GAO and CFPB Inspector General have indicated that the CFPB is generally in compliance with data privacy and security laws. Nevertheless, my Republican colleagues are here today to again criticize and undermine an agency that has returned more than $11 billion to 25 million Americans. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back time she does not have. The chair now recognizes the vice chairman of this committee, the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Fitzpatrick, for 1 minute for an opening statement.
I thank the chairman for the hearing and welcome to the witnesses this morning. Increasingly, our cyber infrastructure and private records are becoming targets of both state and non-state actors alike. I don't have to remind anyone here about the theft of personal information from the Office of Personnel Management. I suspect we all received that letter, or any of the other significant breaches of consumer data that have occurred. For these reasons, it's alarming that any organization, especially an agency of the federal government of the United States, would collect consumer data and store it in a single location, as the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau does, especially when, according to a GAO study, the CFPB lacks procedures and documentation for these collecting practices or security protocols to store private consumer information in a manner safe from hackers. What's more, it seems that no type of data is off limits to the CFPB. While Congress has not been provided a complete picture of these actions, we know that one of these mass collections yielded data on 173 million loans. So we look forward to the hearing, today's witness testimony, and we hope that it allows all of us to develop a better understanding of this practice, and if there's a reason or legitimate need for these aggressive federal practices to continue. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I now want to welcome our witnesses, and because I do want to at one point get to our testimony, I'm not going to spend an hour giving all of the things that Speaker Gingrich has done. What I have realized recently, though, is that he is a fictional author. Just wrote a great book, who my wife finished completing. It's a page-turner. I didn't realize that. But I am going to stick to the basics. He was elected to Congress in 1978 from the 6th District of Georgia, and as we all know, became the Speaker of the House in 1995 through 1998. Speaker Gingrich, welcome and thank you for being here. I want to welcome Mr. Wayne Abernathy. He is the Executive Vice President for Financial Institutions Policy and Regulatory Affairs at the American Bankers Association. Welcome. Dr. Calabria, welcome again. He is the he's the Director of Financial Regulation Studies at the Cato Institute. And finally, but not least, Mr. Deepak Gupta is the founding principal of Gupta Wessler, an appellate litigation boutique in Washington, D.C. Welcome, panel. Each of you are going to be recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony. Without objection, the witnesses' written testimony will be made a part of the record following their oral remarks. Once the witnesses have finished presenting their testimony, each member of the subcommittee will have 5 minutes within which to ask the panel questions. Just as a reminder, many of you know this, but on the table you have three lights. One is green, that means go. Yellow, that means you have a minute left, and red means your time is up. I would just note that if you get a question while your light is yellow, I'll give you the leniency to finish your question as it goes into red, but please don't go on for, a minute or two. Otherwise, I'll start tapping my gavel and we'll try to wrap it up. The microphones are sensitive, so please make sure that you're speaking directly into them. And with that, Speaker Gingrich, welcome, and you are now recognized for your 5-minute presentation.
Good morning, and thank you for allowing me to be here. It's an honor to be with you on this important issue. I do want to say about Mr. Green's concern that if either he or his staff had read the testimony, they would find on page 3 I describe my relationship as an advisor to the U.S. Consumer Coalition. But the subject of today's hearing is important in a narrow sense, in that we have an agency that is collecting more information about Americans' private lives than any bureaucracy deserves for reasons unrelated to national security. But it is also important in a broader sense. Today, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is so far outside the historic American system of constitutionally limited government and the rule of law that it is the perfect case study of the pathologies that infect our bureaucracies at the federal level. It is dictatorial, it is unaccountable, it is practically unrestrained and expanding on its already expansive mandate from Congress, and it is contemptuous of the rights, values, and preferences of ordinary Americans. The CFPB is all of these things, as are many of our large, destructive bureaucracies in this city, a huge problem in its own right. But the CFPB is an especially good symbol of these pathologies because of its unique structure among regulatory agencies. In the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act that created the Bureau, Congress, very unwisely in my opinion, gave up 2 of its core constitutional powers for reining in executive branch agencies. First, The CFPB is not subject to the annual congressional appropriations process, and instead is funded out of a fixed portion of the Federal Reserve's budget. So in effect, you have a bureaucratic slush fund that is self-defined by the bureaucracies on their behalf. Second, its director can be fired only by the president and then only under limited circumstances, because Dodd-Frank protects him from being removed by Congress. For all practical purposes, this means the bureaucracy is free to do whatever it wants within the broadest imaginable interpretation of its authority without fear of losing its funding or its leadership. This is a very dangerous recipe for petty dictatorship and is completely foreign to the American model. I always remind people, Lord Acton's famous dictum, power tends to corrupt. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Notice he drops the tens. There's no better example of the corruption of power than this agency, which is totally secret, totally unaccountable, spending vast amount of money, having huge cost overruns, and doing whatever it wants to whoever it feels like doing it to. We know this formula is dangerous because we have watched the Bureau's behavior over the past 4 years. We have seen the contempt with which it treats Congress and the American people. The CFPB is prohibited from regulating car dealers, but it has done so anyway, using absurdly inaccurate techniques, which, by the way, in the private sector would lead to lawsuits over fraud, to accuse them of racial discrimination and extract fines from car companies and auto finance companies. This is your government as a bully, and it is your government as a blackmailer. The topic of this hearing is another good example of the CFPB's overreach, one I also discussed in my own article in the Wall Street Journal last summer. The CFPB is prohibited in Section 1022 of Dodd-Frank from collecting personally identifiable information on Americans. But the Bureau is doing so anyway, and it is doing so on a massive scale that rivals the NSA's most controversial collection programs, but for much less compelling reasons. The CFPB has said it aims to monitor at least 95% of all credit card transactions in the U.S. by 2016. Toward that end, the Bureau is already collecting and analyzing data from at least 600 million credit card accounts each month. That's 7 billion records in the last year alone. And it's not just credit card data. The CFPB is gathering data on 22 million private label mortgages every month, 5.5 million student loans, 2 million bank accounts with overdraft fees, and on hundreds of thousands of auto sales, credit scores, and deposit advance loans. These secretive and intrusive data gathering operations are taking place without consumers' knowledge and without the ability for consumers to opt out. Unless they have been tuned into occasional congressional oversight hearings like this one, consumers are entirely unaware that government bureaucrats are poring over their credit card transactions every month looking for new products to regulate. The CFPB is scooping up more information about law-abiding Americans than any government agency should be permitted to collect for reasons unrelated to national security or law enforcement. In fact, in a recent poll conducted by Zogby for the U.S. Consumer Coalition, which I happen to advise, let me repeat that since it's in the record, but I just want to make sure for particularly Mr. Green's staff that they get it, which I happen to advise, so I'm not secret about the relationship. Just 1 in 5 Americans said they believe the CFPB should be allowed to gather credit card statements without consumers' knowledge. For those of you who are concerned about the intelligence community's data collection effort, I don't see how you can be worried about the potential for abuse and about the, in fact, justified lack of transparency in national security agencies and not be concerned about the same dangers in this large and unaccountable bureaucracy armed with similar kinds of information. Think of the absurdity of being told that Homeland Security will not look at Facebook pages of foreigners out of concern for their privacy while CFPB is gathering up all of this data. Let me just say, certainly if the NSA and the FBI need a warrant to collect such data on U.S. citizens for the purpose of preventing terrorism, the CFPB should need to get a warrant too. In closing, what we have in the CFPB is an agency that is not accountable to Congress or the American people, an agency that is stretching the boundaries of its authority as far as it can, and a bureaucracy which, for all practical purposes, is out of control. As the American people's elected representatives in Congress, this should bother you no matter which side of the aisle you're on and whatever you think of the Bureau's preferred regulations. It is imperative that we move toward abolishing the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and at the very least subject it to annual budgeting and appropriations process in addition to restructuring its leadership to make sure it is accountable to Congress. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Mr. Abernathy, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Duffy and Ranking Member Green, for this opportunity to testify. My name is Wayne Abernathy. I'm Executive Vice President at the American Bankers Association. The customers of ABA's thousands of member banks are affected by the actions, policies, and decisions of the Consumer Bureau. The Bureau has enormous authority over retail financial products, those who provide them, and therefore over the people who use them. This power comes with little more than nominal oversight and accountability. It would be hard to find a federal agency where the gap between regulatory power and public accountability is greater. Bureau officials repeatedly assert that the Bureau is a transparent and data-driven agency. Public exposure and data are to be the checks on the natural tendency for any such agency to stray into arbitrary action. I emphasize the Bureau is governed by one person. No one in the agency can address him without ultimately bending to that one person's policy judgment, knowing that at some point in the discussion it will end with, "Yes, sir." We welcome this subcommittee's inquiry into the question of how strong a check on arbitrary behavior are the Bureau's data policies and practices. How much is the Bureau, in fact, data-driven? And by which data? From which sources? And how would we know? Bureau Director Richard Cordray stated the following, quote, "At the Consumer Bureau, we are a data-driven agency. The best decisions will be those that are best informed," end quote. The Bureau's strategic plan for FY 2013 through 2017 includes the following, quote, "We take in data, manage it, store it, share it appropriately, and protect it from unauthorized access," end quote. And then this from the Bureau's website on a page titled Open Government, quote, "Transparency is at the core of our agenda, and it is a key part of how we operate," end quote. We support those statements. Bureau practices, however, have not lived up to these standards, and there is little to require that they do so. The Dodd-Frank Act extends to the Bureau impressive authorities for requiring information. The Act's oversight structure is much less impressive. Problematic Bureau data practices have undermined the effective use of data to serve as a check on arbitrary action and weakened the quality of policymaking, placing at risk the Bureau's mission to protect consumers. In my written statement, I discuss several examples, which I will merely list for you at this point. The Bureau evades public disclosure laws, such as the Paperwork Reduction Act, while cherry-picking data. In selective data samples, the Bureau skews results, mischaracterizing consumer markets. The Bureau has misrepresented its data gathering on overdrafts. On its website, the Bureau publishes unverified complaint information. In its arbitration study, the Bureau ignores its own data. To promote its policies on indirect auto lending, the Bureau has manufactured data that do not exist. I will explain briefly one of these as an example, the unverified complaint information. The Bureau publishes on its official webpage, at the top of which are the words, "an official website of the United States government." They publish consumer complaints that are unverified for accuracy or veracity. The Bureau asserts that, quote, "by adding their voice, consumers help improve the financial marketplace," end quote. But how can this be true if the information provided is unreliable and misleading? What does the Bureau offer to protect a consumer from acting on erroneous information published on the Bureau's own website? ABA offers 4 recommendations in our written statement. I would emphasize our 4th. The governance of the Bureau should be changed from a sole directorship to governance by a bipartisan commission. With a bipartisan structure, we gain light from a variety of viewpoints. different people posing different questions from different backgrounds, all more likely to poke and prod the data, and all of them likely to be intolerant of information legerdemain. On behalf of ABA and its member banks of all business models serving hundreds of millions of people, our customers and your constituents impacted by Bureau decisions by the Consumer Bureau, I want to thank this subcommittee for this very important inquiry. I would be happy to respond to any questions you might have.
Thank you. Dr. Calabria, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Duffy, Ranking Member Green, distinguished members of the subcommittee, I thank you for the invitation to appear at today's important hearing. Let me first say that the concerns I will raise are not unique to the CFPB. They apply across the federal government. Let me also note that my colleagues and I at the Cato Institute have consistently raised these concerns regardless of politics or the mission of the agency. We have been vocal highlighting abuses in law enforcement and national security. I would go as far to say we have spent considerable resources trying to undo the third-party doctrine, which is the basis of almost all federal surveillance. So again, this is not something new to us. In fact, we have spent more time on the Patriot Act and Bank Secrecy Act than we have on surveillance at the Consumer Protection Bureau. So again, this is not something new for us. Let me also, as I detail in my testimony, the massive data collection at the CFPB is one of choice. There is no explicit mandate or requirement for this level of data collection. As someone who has previously managed one of the offices that have been transferred to the CFPB, I can say to the extent of this data collection is also unnecessary for it to fill its responsibilities. During my tenure enforcing the Real Estate Settlement Procedures Act at HUD, we nearly doubled enforcement, significantly increased enforcement action, and we did so without having to resort to a massive dragnet of consumer data. Obviously and unfortunately, some actions did not prevent the financial crisis, but I would have told you then, as I'll tell you today, the problems with RESPA and much of our consumer financial protection are in the underlying statutes, which I greatly encourage Congress to revisit, not from a lack of surveillance. We have seen this play out in the area of national security, where the public is repeatedly told that if only we had more data, various attacks would have been avoided. Yet repeatedly, the intelligence failures we witness are not from a lack of data. They are from an inability or unwillingness to connect the dots. Similarly, the financial crisis was met with demands for more data, as if the overheated housing and mortgage markets were not obvious enough from the aggregate data. They were obvious to me over a decade ago. Unfortunately, our regulators ignored them. And of course, more data does not necessarily help you if you continue to ignore it. The CFPB has not been immune from this false idol of more data. As GR has reported, the CFPB has engaged in at least 12 large-scale data collection efforts. At least 3 of these include information that directly identifies individual consumers. Combining this information with other sources, such as the other 9, could allow information also to be identified on consumers. In my opinion, granted as a non-lawyer, I believe these collections do not comply fully with the Right to Financial Privacy Act. Let me also state, as a former federal employee and one subject to the recent OPM breach, I don't trust any part of the government with my data, the CFPB or otherwise. In consolidating all of this financial information in one place, the CFPB has left consumers extremely vulnerable to hackers and identity theft. Those are only threats from outside the Bureau. Unfortunately, the CFPB's data collection, in my opinion, also poses significant threats to our Fourth Amendment protections, which I believe apply to everybody, even financial service providers. As Justice Douglas observed in his dissent to the California bankers case, quote, a checking account may well record a citizen's activities, opinions, beliefs as fully as the transcripts of his telephone records. Credit cards are today's checks. Such concerns are not simply reflections of the Watergate era. As recently as 2012, Justice Sotomayor, in her concurrence to United States versus Antoine Jones, correctly observed, quote, awareness that the government may be watching chills associational and expressive freedoms. The government's unrestrained power to assemble data that reveal private aspects of identity is susceptible to abuse. Justice Sotomayor's words, not mine. Justice Sotomayor offers the example of medications purchased online by online retailers. Such a purchase could theoretically be identified within the CFPB's data card collections. For a variety of reasons, as I think this hearing is demonstrated on across the aisle, the CFPB has become a highly partisan issue. I think that is unfortunate. Were it to use the financial records of its critics as an attempt to silence or intimidate those critics, it would not be the first agency to do so. And as an institute at the Cato Institute where we receive our donations via credit card, this is a very real risk, and certainly one that we worry about. I will only quote Justice Thurgood Marshall, who sadly observed, quote, the technique of examining bank records to investigate political organizations is unfortunately not a rare one. And someone as at the Cato Institute who regularly takes a stand that is occasionally unpopular in Washington, I certainly share and fear this concern. My suggestion would be that the CFPB end these data collections. I would submit there is more than enough work to do actually responding to consumer complaints. I thank the subcommittee for their time and look forward to your questions.
Mr. Gupta, you're now recognized for 5 minutes for a summary of your opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Duffy and Ranking Member Green. I'll make 3 points this morning based on my perspective as a former CFPB official and as an advocate for consumers, including in data privacy cases. First, privacy and the security of consumer data are important issues. And if this subcommittee were really concerned, there are real problems it could be addressing. There have been major data breaches recently in which credit card information was stolen from consumers at Target and Home Depot, for example. But this subcommittee hasn't held a single hearing on those real-world threats. Instead, we're having a hearing about a set of imagined problems that exist only in the minds of the CFPB's political opponents. In fact, if you ask the actual consumer privacy groups, they voice support for the CFPB's data collection efforts, and I believe there's a statement that's been entered into the record today, or will be. As one privacy advocate put it, the reason you don't hear from privacy or consumer groups is that the CFPB is not doing anything that concerns us, nor, for that matter, is it doing much differently than other regulators have always done. Second, to the extent that it's doing anything different, the Bureau's collection of data is creating the kind of oversight and consumer protection that were missing before the financial crisis. For example, the compilation of anonymous account-level data, I want to stress that, it's anonymous account-level data from the CFPB's credit card database has allowed the Bureau to study important topics such as credit card marketing practices and the widespread use of forced arbitration clauses in consumer contracts, something Congress required the CFPB to study. Data collection is crucial to the Bureau's ability to identify systemic violations of consumer laws, discrepancies in credit score reporting, and harmful effects of checking account overdraft programs, to name just a few examples. The CFPB's data collection ensures that the agency's regulation and enforcement are data-driven, that is, based on the best understanding of market trends and empirical reality. That's the whole point of having expert administrative agencies in the first place. So unless your profits come from deceiving consumers, you should welcome the CFPB's data collection. Third, and finally, the very existence of this hearing illustrates one danger that can occur when public officials don't base their actions on data. We have a made-up controversy, unfortunately, based on made-up facts. The CFPB is not spying on American citizens. It is not the NSA. It's not interested in the details of people's personal activities, nor would the data that the agency is currently collecting enable it to investigate those activities, even if it were interested in, say, what you plan to buy tomorrow with your credit card for a Christmas present for your grandmother. In fact, the vast majority of the data collected by the CFPB is already public, such as data on mortgages already recorded in local land records, or auto sales on record with the DMV. And most of it is aggregate data at the account level, not at the transaction level, designed to give the agency a picture of what financial institutions, not individual consumers, are up to. The GAO looked into this controversy and in a detailed review found that none of the major problems that the CFPB's opponents have alleged exist. Of the 12 major projects analyzed by the GAO, only 3 even potentially involved any personal consumer data, and the GAO found that the CFPB had taken steps to protect and secure the data it collects and has a system for anonymizing any material involving identifying information. And I want to correct one factual inaccuracy that I heard several times already this morning. None of the ongoing data collections by the CFPB contains personally identifiable information. That's a fact that's been verified by the GAO. Agencies have been collecting this same stuff for years and nobody has complained, which GAO also found. The story with consumer complaint data is similar. The Inspector General did an exhaustive review and uncovered no major problems. Of the 250,000 complaints examined, the IG's audit found an accuracy rate of 99.99%, an error rate of 0.01%. I wish that most of the work product that emanated from this building, for example, could meet that accuracy standard. Meanwhile, the financial industry is collecting far more personally identifiable data that could open up real questions about consumer privacy. The J.P. Morgan Chase Institute, for example, recently released a report that pulled from a data set of 12 billion individual consumer transactions. So if we're really worried about the collection of this kind of data, we should be far more concerned about the private market that is developing for this data. And with all the real problems in consumer finance, I think it's unfortunate that the subcommittee feels the need to hold a hearing today on this non-issue. Thank you for inviting me to testify, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, panel. The chair now recognizes the vice chairman of the panel, the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Fitzpatrick, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Duffy, for calling the hearing. The hearing is critically important given all the security breaches that we've been hearing about and reading about in the private sector of the economy, among retailers, but most importantly in the public sector. And in most of those cases, the average American citizen does not know that their information is being collected by the federal government or that the security has been breached. They just don't know that. Speaker Gingrich, you talked about the two constitutional provisions that the United States Congress essentially walked away from in passing Dodd-Frank and creating the CFPB, and then you testified about all the personally identifiable information that the CFPB is collecting. And so I have two questions. First, are you concerned about the CFPB's ability to protect and secure that information from breaches? And then the second question is, when you have an agency of the federal government that essentially lacks accountability or oversight from the Congress, what is the interest or the vigilance that the agency would have to actually get down and protect that information? So how is the CFPB different than other agencies?
Well, thank you for the question. Let me say, first of all, anybody who believes that anyone has the ability to guarantee security of information is totally out of touch with the real world. I mean, when you look at the size of the breaches and you look at the number of hackers around the planet and you look at the intensity with which people are trying to figure out how to do this, there's no place where you're going to aggregate information unless you take it totally offline that you're going to have real true security. The systems are growing very rapidly. They're getting much more sophisticated, and we're going to be in a very different world. And it's like the Wild West. And people, this is not like 10 years ago, and it's going to get worse. Second, I want to point out that in the Wall Street Journal article, I cited a Stanford study on how to take metadata from telephones and connect them to get individual identity, and an MIT study for how to do that with credit cards. So when people say to you, oh, we're only gathering impersonal information, the fact is that's a sign they don't understand how big data has evolved and the fact that you can reassess and redefine people if you have enough data points. So I find it much more frightening to have government bureaucracies that are uncontrolled having that level of information and power. In the private sector, if I don't like a company, I can quit. That isn't how it works if you're a citizen and two bureaucrats show up at your front door.
Mr. Gupta, if a constituent of mine in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, had her personal information or her financial habits stolen in a data breach of the CFPB, how would you explain to her that it was necessary for the federal government to collect and store this information in the first place?
I would first explain to her that the whole premise of the question is false, because as I said, none of the ongoing collection efforts by the CFPB involve any personally identifiable information. And that is verified by the GAO report, and it's pursuant to the statutory authority. The authority that this Congress gave the CFPB to do ongoing market monitoring expressly comes with a limitation that says that that market monitoring, that data cannot include personally identifiable information. And the CFPB, the GAO found, is complying with that mandate. So to the extent there's any personal identifiable information, it's either going to be because she provided it as part of a consumer complaint, and that information is not going to be information that would be damaging. It would be information that allows the agency to get in touch with her. Or, for example, when there's supervision and enforcement and the agency needs the person's contact information to get in touch with them to return, to reimburse them if they've been defrauded. But those are really small exceptions.
Dr. Calabria, do you concur that my constituents should have no concern with what the CFPB holds?
I do not concur. I mean, maybe I need to reread a few times the GAO report, but my read of it is pretty clear that at least 3 of those programs do have personally identifiable information. And there's also a question of, can you take the information in those programs and link to other programs that aren't personally identifiable, and I think that there's a very real risk there. And again, as I noted in my testimony, I was a victim of the OPM breach, and I'm very touched that OPM has now made sure that I get at least a year of credit check free. That's very touching. I would personally like the Chinese to give me my information back and not to use it. It's kind of hard to close that barn door after the horse is out. So I think we need to be thinking ahead of time. The point to react is not after the breaches. The point to react is to not collect this level of data if you don't need it to begin with.
I think most of us who also were victims of that same breach would agree with you, Doctor. Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the ranking member, Ms. Waters, for 5 minutes.
Oh, thank you very much. Let me welcome all of our panelists here today, and especially Speaker Gingrich. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Speaker Gingrich, who are you representing here today?
I represent myself.
What is the name of the PR firm that you work for?
The U.S. Consumer Coalition is not a PR firm. It's an organization which has been raising questions. I work with them. I've said that publicly. I said it, in fact, in the testimony we submitted here. And I think the questions they raise are very good ones. But my view,
The coalition.
my view is not shaped by that. I am a
Excuse me,
conservative.
I'm not interested in that
sorry.
right now,
I
Mr.
apologize.
Speaker. The coalition has hired a PR firm that you work for. You work for the PR firm, is that right?
We work with the coalition.
Do you work for the PR firm that's hired by the coalition?
I'd have to check to see whether it's,
The ranking member,
Okay,
but there's no question we work with the coalition.
Okay.
We said-
would the ranking member yield? If you would.
Yes, the ranking member will yield.
Mr. Speaker, I have your Wall Street Journal article wherein there's an indication at the end that you are a paid advisor to the Wise Public Affairs Group. Are you denying this, Mr. Speaker?
No, I'm not.
That was a question that the ranking member was asking. I'll yield back to the ranking member.
Thank you very much. And the coalition is funded by what industries?
I don't know.
The coalition represent any other consumer groups? Do they advocate for any other consumer groups, or is it just organized to deal with their concerns about the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau?
Well, my impression is that they think that the threat from the CFPB is large enough that that's their primary focus. And
I'm
it
not
is the only
interested,
bureaucracy.
Mr. Speaker, not in your impression, but is that exactly what they do? Just
I don't know.
the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau?
You'd have to call them and ask them. I don't.
Well,
They asked me to advise on one thing.
I know that you're very smart, Mr. Speaker, and you wouldn't work for somebody that you didn't know who they are and what they do. So that's why I ask you. But let me just move on, because I know you understand how this place works. You talked about the fact that it's the only agency that operates in the way that it does, that it's the only agency that does not have to go before the Appropriations Committee. Do you really know and understand that to be true?
That is certainly my impression. But if you find other agencies that have perpetual life by drawing money in manners that has nothing to do with the Congress, I think Congress ought to frankly then hold hearings and bringing them within the Constitution.
Are you aware that, for example, the FHFA has one director appointed by the president, can only be removed by the president, and does not go before any appropriations committee? Are you aware of that?
I wasn't aware of it, but as I just said, to the degree you'd like to give us a list that we could suggest to Congress that they bring under annual
Mr.
appropriations,
Speaker, I know that you know how this place ran. You ran it with a strong hand. So I know you understand how it works. The FDIC, does the FDIC go before an appropriations committee?
I believe it is subject to congressional supervision.
That's
I
not
believe
what
it
I
answers
asked.
congressional inquiries.
That was not my question. In terms of, what the president is able to do in determining whether or not a director continues as director, the OCC, for example, the director can only be fired by the president, isn't that right? And the same thing with the FHFA, is that correct?
That's correct.
And the Fed, they don't go before an appropriations committee, is that right?
That's right. In fact, I've favored auditing the Fed for that very reason.
And the president, for example, can only remove the head of the SEC, is that right?
Yes.
Okay, so I just want us to be clear when we compare the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau with other agencies. Some of us are very appreciative that Dodd-Frank created the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau because prior to the meltdown that we had, the recession that we entered into, nobody was protecting the consumers. We had all of our oversight agencies who basically were supposed to be responsible for soundness, et cetera, but they did nothing for consumers. And so now we have the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and we have a whole effort to destroy it. The other side of the aisle have made this the top priority in everything that they do. And just as Mr. Gupta said, while we had this breach with Target and others, never have we had a hearing on any of that. So I'm glad that you're here today, but I want you to share your knowledge with us and tell us what you know and what you understand rather than some of the other stuff that I'm hearing. I yield back the balance of my time.
Can I make one brief comment?
Maybe you can ask, I want to
Okay.
stick within the rules. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Tipton, 4 or 5 minutes. Maybe he would entertain the speaker's request.
Thank you, Chairman Duffy. Mr. Speaker.
No, I just want to make the comment, the gentlelady just pointed out that all of these various bureaucracies that were responsible for oversight prior to 2007 failed. And so the answer is let's build another bureaucracy to look after the failed bureaucracies, as opposed to looking at why did all these bureaucracies fail? I think it's a fascinating difference of opinion. I appreciate your pointing out that we actually should have a study, which Cato may already have, of all of the agencies that that should be under congressional annual appropriation. I thought that was a very useful contribution.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Gupta, I'd like to start with you in regards to personal information. You'd made the comment that no personal information is collected. Is gender an identifier?
Is gender an identifier? Gender standing alone with nothing else?
How about if we included age? Would that be an identifier, those two together? How about ethnicity, if we included those 3 elements? Are those things that can be used to identify an individual?
I think I take your point, and you're right. I mean, a constellation of data can certainly be used to identify someone without their name, and the CFPB is very concerned about that, and that's why if you read the GAO report, you'll see that they have a data intake team that carefully scrubs the data before it even enters the Bureau and is disseminated to ensure that you don't have the constellation of data that can be assembled to actually identify anyone.
Well, interestingly, Mr. Gupta, under the CFPB with the NMBD, they do require the collection of gender, age, and ethnicity. Mr. Calabria, would you like to maybe comment on that?
Well, again, I would agree that only a small number of information is needed to identify people. I do want to emphasize, as I pointed out in my testimony, as the Federal Reserve Inspector General pointed out, a significant amount of the CFPB data collection is maintained by contractors on cloud computing, which in my opinion, granted, not a tech expert, but leaves it particularly vulnerable to hacking. So I would certainly encourage the CFPB to bring more of that data. Here, I'm going to say it for a second. Cato Institute, Mark Calabria, encourages less use of contractors, more government employees. In this case.
Does GAO report that CFP does not have the security protocols in place to be able to secure this data? Does that secure you?
That is correct, and that is a very big concern of mine, the security of this data.
You know, if I could follow up again with you, Doctor, for a long time I've held the belief that a lot of the regulatory bodies, the heart may be in the right place, but we need to be able to look at outcomes. And I get a general sense, going back to Speaker Gingrich's point, that we actually have an institution right now through the CFPB that is completely off the books. Congress has no real control to be able to actually control it, to be able to direct it. Do you have a sense that we have a system in place that is continuing to build, that is designed to be able to fine and punish rather than help and improve?
So let me first say, and I mean, there's a fair amount of work in the psychology literature about when people feel like that they're wrapped up in a cause and self-righteous, and I think that certainly the CFPB's attitude is we are a crusade. We're here to protect the consumer. We're going to fix the financial crisis, and we saw the same thing in the intelligence community after 9/11. When you get caught up in this mentality, You get blinders, you get tunnel vision. A lot of psychology research that I think clearly demonstrates that. And so what you need, and again, I would reference one of the citations in my testimony from something by Cass Sunstein, of all people, who really argued that you need to have procedures and checks in place so that dissent is heard. And this is one of the value of a board is that somebody sits there and says, just like this committee can have this dialogue and this back and forth, is there needs to be this back and forth. And Wayne talked about at the end of the day, every employee at the CFPB needs to say, yes, sir, to Mr. Cordray. And I think that's a real problem. None of us have all the answers, and you lack this institution for this dialogue and this back and forth and this give and take. You need that. In other places that don't have this, don't do well. You know, as was mentioned, a number of other agencies, you know, look at OFEO, who was the regulator for Fannie and Freddie, single director. We saw how that turned out. So again, the attitude that you can't have this sort of give and take, I think is critically important. I'll also note the argument you often hear is we need a single director, so does it get captured by the industry? Well, you know, I'm not a mathematician, but the last I checked, I think it would be easier to capture one person than it would to capture, say, 5.
You know, one thing that genuinely concerns me about this, if we were to apply the same rules to the CFPB that they are trying to apply to everyone else, if we were getting ready to make a mortgage, and again, go back to the comments in terms of identifiers about gender, age, ethnicity in determining and making a loan, they're collecting this data with no consumer knowledge. How would the CFPB address a private sector entity in doing that?
Well, let me make two quick points since we're out of time. First of all, the JP Morgan example, I can choose not to use JP Morgan, and if I do, I can sue them if they distribute my data in a personal way. And plus, they suffer. Target took a big hit. You don't see any of this with the federal government in terms of these corrections. But lastly, I want to say we don't have to wonder how this works. The HMDA is an example of where there's not personally identifiable information, but you can link it to courthouse records to figure out the identity. It's not that hard.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank all of you for being here. Appreciate it very much. And I am, Mr. Speaker, you may have misspoken. So you said that the CFPB was totally secret, and so I'm assuming you didn't, that you weren't. And I'm not. This is not a catch your wrong question. When you made the comment, I just wrote it down because I didn't think you were saying that that the CFPB was a totally secret agency.
Well, my impression is if you look at various hearings and various interrogatories, that the leader of the CFPB has remarkably little interest in sharing with Congress a whole range of information, including the various cost overruns, including salaries,
Yeah, I know.
and so forth. And so my impression is that they are a remarkably secretive operation for a non-national security operation.
Okay, I agree with you if you use remarkably secretive as opposed to totally secretive, because if it was totally secretive, we wouldn't have this hearing.
I'm happy to be amended to remarkably.
Thank you. Mr. Abernathy, do you think that it is important that we have evidence-based policies?
Absolutely, Congressman. In our view, when you have an agency that's led by just one individual without all of the other checks and balances and oversight that other agencies are subject to, you're left with just one check, and that is the exposure to the public. Letting the public see what is the information that you use to make your decisions, and let's have a debate on that to make sure you're not operating in an arbitrary manner. I can think of no agency where that is more important than it would be the Bureau to make sure that they avoid getting into arbitrary action. That's why we're so concerned about their data practices.
Yes. Here's something that I'm interested in. What county do you live in?
I live in Fairfax County, Virginia.
I'm not familiar with the way the county operates, but do you believe that the county has data on your mortgage?
Well, I don't have a mortgage anymore, but I think when I had a mortgage, Did the county have? They probably had some information, but what's interesting about Fairfax County, they have a series of 7, I believe, elected officials, and these officials all are peers of one another, and they check one another's activities, and that prevents the abuse of data because they'll call somebody else on it. They'll say, Madam Chairman, whoever, there is more information that you need to take into account. There is no one like that at the Bureau. There is no peer at the Bureau for the director of the Bureau. Everybody reports to him.
Well, most counties, maybe not in Fairfax, but most of the other counties around the country, they have a lot of data on your mortgage. They have a lot of data on well, not on your mortgage, but on people who hold mortgages. A lot of data. The same thing, I think, holds true when you, think about some of the commercial data that is available. The DMV, does it not have a lot of data about individuals who drive and about the machine they drive?
Yes, they certainly do, Congressman. I think what makes the Bureau different is that they can put all these different pieces together. If you look at the authority that's been given them under Dodd-Frank, there is virtually nothing that a covered firm subject to its jurisdiction, has in terms of information that the Bureau cannot demand. And in their recent data collections, they've been gathering in enormous amounts of those data and putting it all in one place.
We probably had more hearings on the CFPB than we've had on anything. So I think it's erroneous to say, there's nobody looking at the agency. That's all we do. It's become the political punching bag of this whole Congress. And maybe the Speaker was right. You look at the OCC, the FDIC, and the Federal Reserve. They are all in the data collection business. And so, I think, we can create this attitude that this is going to be a big brother operation and they're going to give money to the Taliban or whatever. I think we're taking this stuff too far. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman,
There's no time.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Maine, Mr. Poliquin, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Appreciate it very much. And thank you, gentlemen, for coming here today. I appreciate it. I come from the private sector, and for 35 years I've been running small companies. And when you come from the business background, you have to be accountable all the time. You have to be accountable to your employees, to your customers, to your suppliers. You have to be accountable to your board. And if you have a product or a service that's overpriced or performs poorly, you're going to go out of business. Now, it seems to me that we should do the same thing here in government, but unfortunately, it doesn't happen very often. When I was state treasurer up in Maine, I was on the board of an independent public housing authority. And shortly after joining the board, I realized that the executive director had a 5-year term appointed by the governor, couldn't be fired. The board had no authority. The executive director didn't report to the board. And it had a funding source that was independent of appropriations. And after a little bit more digging, we found out that we had 6,000 families waiting in Maine to come in out from under the cold so they could have a safe and warm place to live. And we had a public housing authority that was spending money on theater programs for prison inmates, as well as the fact that any request from the board to get data on how the operation was performing was just ignored. And then we found out that they were spending twice to build one-bedroom apartments than it did to buy a single-family home on a quarter acre with a garage, 2 bathrooms, and 3 bedrooms. So we changed the law. We made sure that the executive director reported to the board. We put in financial controls, and we put business people on the board. And by the time I left, the cost per unit had dropped about 35%. It was still going down, and we helped hundreds more families. Now, I'm looking, Mr. Gingrich, at the CFPB. And we've got an independent organization, as you mentioned, that reports to nobody. The director has a 5-year contract, can only be replaced by the president. They have a revenue stream that's divorced of appropriations from Congress. And I'm asking you, does it make sense when the executive director shows up here 6 months ago and tries to convince us that it's a darn good idea to spend $216 million on an office building for their 1,400 employees to rehab it, and they don't own it? with a 2-story waterfall in the building and a reflecting pool and a playground on the roof. Now, how can we trust these people to collect the sort of data that they're doing here in America for our families? In our district, we had a major breach of data security with the largest health insurance provider in the state. Thousands of people in our district had their personal data violated. So I ask you, Mr. Speaker, who has a lot of experience in this area, what can we do to fix this? Do you trust this organization to collect the sort of data that they are? And if not, how in the dickens do you fix it?
Well, thank you, and I have to confess, the entire story about the Maine Housing Authority is amazing. It would almost be a study in its own right. Let me say, first of all, just to set the record straight, both the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission had consumer protection responsibilities prior to 2008. So this notion that magically we're going to create a new super bureaucracy on top of the other bureaucracies because this new bureaucracy will be terrific. And you just described the arrogance of power. Since they're totally uncontrolled and since they're virtuous and should not be questioned, why shouldn't they have a waterfall in the atrium? Why shouldn't they be able to walk in and look up and think, I'm here to protect America on my terms, based on my prejudice and applying my ideology, and aren't you lucky to have me as the savior of your consumer behavior? That tells you everything about why this agency ought to be abolished. I mean, whether you want to break it up and put it back at the FTC and DOJ, whatever, but one other thing, they will not tell you, the CFPB will not tell you all of their various data gathering techniques, but we are told that there are consumer data companies which sell information to them which includes personal data. Now that should be findable, and that's the kind of thing we want to say, explain to me why you think you're going to keep this anonymous given modern technology and modern information systems.
For us here today and those listening, Mr. Speaker, can you give us another couple tangible examples, to the best of your knowledge, of how you connect data protection with accountability in government agencies like this?
Well, as I said earlier, I think anytime you start centralizing information into specific banks of data, you have to assume that you're really at high risk. And I would raise the question, again, we always have the government show up and tell us everything's fine until the next huge data breach. And then they come back to tell us, but now everything's really fine. We are in a competition in which there is a free market of hackers worldwide, all of whom can operate without red tape, without limitations, without all of our various rules and regulations, and bureaucratic structures that are stunningly slow and incompetent. I find no reason to believe this particular structure is going to be dramatically better than OPM at protecting data, and I think aggregating the numbers I gave you earlier, billions of data points in one place, is really defying everything we've learned about the emergence of a very aggressive hacking culture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Appreciate it very much.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Fincher, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Gupta, would you support a 5-person governing panel instead of the one director at the agency?
I would not. I think there are lots of, as Ranking Member Waters mentioned, there are lots of agencies that have single directors.
Okay, that's it. Would you support having CFPB under the appropriation process?
No, I would not. I think, the OCC, lots of other banking regulators are not subject to the appropriations process, but they have even worse source of funding historically. They've gotten their funding from the entities they're regulating. Instead, what you have here is a stream of money that comes from the Federal Reserve Board, and it prevents agency capture. It prevents the agency from being subject to the thing that makes Washington broken in every respect, which is, the influence of financial industry money. That's why we're having so many hearings, I assume,
well,
about
what
this
makes Washington broken is too much Washington and too many bureaucrats. I think the narrative here that we're hearing from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, and no offense to Ms. Waters, the ranking member, excuse me, her passion, she's very passionate about this, she just happens to be wrong, is the American people aren't smart enough to make decisions on their own. So bureaucrats and politicians in Washington are going to tell them what to do. Another one of my colleagues trying to compare data collection at the CFPB to my county and my rural district in Tennessee is a joke. We look back at what a lot of the reasoning behind Dodd-Frank and behind the CFPB, because the private sector was out of control. When a lot of respect, it was Fannie and Freddie that was influencing the private sector and telling banks who to loan money to and who not to. So let's get to the facts. The facts are, for a lot of my friends on the left, they see the private sector as a problem, and everything should be done in Washington and by bureaucrats and politicians. This is a slap in the face to the American people. They are smart enough to figure out what works and what doesn't, and they don't need people in Washington doing it for them. Mr. Abernathy, if the CFPB were to use this data irresponsibly, are you concerned with a lack of accountability? And how would we rein them in? They're almost untouchables.
And that is a serious problem. That's one of the things that we believe this hearing is bringing out, is the fact that all you have to act as accountability for the Bureau is the public exposure of the data that they claim that they rely upon. And yet when we look at the decisions that they have made, rather than relying upon the data to drive what they do, they cherry pick the data in a process, through processes that they don't reveal to the public, in order to silence debate rather than to foment debate, by basically saying, this is what the data tells us we have to do, therefore there should be no discussion. In one case, they've actually demonstrated the value, and that is with regard to their arbitration study, where they did put the data out for people to look at, and the data actually disproves the assumptions they make in their study, but it encourages a broad discussion by the public, and that's what we need.
Doctor?
I want to make a couple points, but first I want to go back to the funding issue. You have to remind ourselves that the CFPB is funded in the same way that the Federal Reserve itself is funded, and I think it's widely accepted that the Federal Reserve fell down on the job before the crisis, despite being outside of the funding process. And of course, as we know, Mr. Greenspan, Mr. Bernanke, Mrs. Yellen, they're not accepting campaign contributions from Wall Street. That's not why they screwed up. They screwed up for a number of reasons. Of course, you could try to say, well, they screwed up because Greenspan has some crazy ideology or whatever. That's actually an illustration of why you don't want one single powerful person, because how will you know that that person's not going to get the check and balance? And in fact, the only way that we know that there were discussions about subprime lending at the Federal Reserve is because Ned Gramlich, one of the board members, forced that conversation. And that was a conversation that was at least had, which would have not have been had if it was a single director. So again, let me clearly state for the record so that we don't have to go back over this topic, the CFPB is not the only part of the federal government or our financial regulatory structure that's broken. We can go with, I think we can accept that. I don't subscribe to the two wrongs makes a right theory of policy. So just because something is broken over at Agency A does not, in my opinion, justify us to leave something broken at Agency B.
My time's expiring. Let me just say this in closing. Remember, and hopefully a Republican administration will take over in 2017, and my friends across the aisle would be singing a very different tune at that time.
Board will look good.
But let's remember that, as to your point, two wrongs don't make a right. We need to call this out for what it is, and if Republicans were doing it, it would be wrong also. But let's fix this, and please, my friends across on the other side of the aisle, give the American people some credit. They are smarter than Washington. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Hill, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for calling this hearing, and it's certainly good for me to see my old friend Wayne Abernathy. We served so long ago on the Senate Banking Committee staff, Mr. Speaker, there was no TV in the Senate. That's how long ago it was. Many moons have passed. And I feel like Rip Van Winkle when I come back to Washington after 25 years and see this kind of behavior. And this isn't the first time we've talked about a subject like this at this hearing. FINRA proposed a proposal called CARDS, where they would sweep up every brokerage account in the country and every brokerage transaction and organize it in a way that it would not be identifiable so that they could just look at it. And my whole problem with things like this is just because you can doesn't mean you should in these massive data collections, when a simple sample would do just as well in trying to look at for a trend analysis. And further, our whole regulatory system has been based on looking at institutions and looking at the activities of that institution on a small-scale basis and making determinations about did the executives of that institution do a good or bad job with regard to consumer legislation or prudential regulation. And it's not been this sweeping 170 million loan records, for example, that are now in the hands of the CFPB. And in my district in Arkansas, this spring has been taken up by working 70 cases of IRS identity theft. And it's all we talk about in my office is identity theft problems with federally stored data. So I've got concerns about that. Mr. Gupta being here, you know, it reinforces, I think, why I ran for Congress and why I was glad the people of Arkansas elected me to Congress, because once again, I feel like you're the chief apologist for an intrusive big brother, big government solution. We have had hearings, sir, in this room on the Target breach. We had retailers and bankers testify about those breaches, and we have bills moving in the Energy and Commerce Committee in this House and in this committee, Financial Services, to deal with that. So don't make the assumption that we have not had data breach discussions.
And I commend you for those efforts. Those are good efforts.
Thank you. And you talked about this committee is making up facts, when in fact I think the Wall Street Journal was quite clear, and I commend the staff of this committee in the made-up fact arena. It's the CFPB in their auto finance investigation that has gotten the world record for made-up facts in their most recent efforts. So I'd like to get some thoughts, Mr. Speaker, on this issue of the CFPB claims it needs all this information in order to understand the markets it regulates. In my opening comments, I talked about, you know, individual firms and individual prudential managers deal with markets, and that's how we've traditionally regulated. And they've collected 87% of the credit card market. They've collected 95%, it's trying to get 95% of all the credit card accounts. What do you think is any justification for that when one could just do a survey of credit card vendors for a small sample to meet any analysis, it seems to me, that would have a public policy benefit? Could you comment on that for me, please?
Well, thank you. Look, Hayek in The Road to Serfdom made the argument that once you start toward centralized planning, you inevitably coerce, and that the centralized planners think of themselves as virtuous and as having a fact-based approach to life, when in fact they're like the rest of us. They have ideologies, they have things they like, they have things they don't like. I mean, it's very funny in a sense. This is a monster which, if Democrats thought about it, they would rush to create a bipartisan board. I mean, imagine you got a President Cruz or a President Trump, and they decided to appoint their version of this kind of collection agency. And that person was now in total charge of gathering the data they wanted to gather, so that, let's say, instead of being anti-gun, as the current group is, they decided they were pro-gun. And so they decided that you really ought to have lots of credit if you're a gun dealership, and so forth. I mean, you need to understand, when you put total power in one person's hands, and they can operate in not total secrecy, but surprisingly
remarkably secrecy. Yeah.
Remarkable secrecy. You are creating a natural pattern that leads to very dangerous behavior for this reason. The government always, in the end, is about power and the ability of the state to coerce. And when you have people in darkness who are able to exercise the power of the state, they apply their prejudice and their ideology, and that can destroy normal people because the government is so big and so powerful.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have Fourth Amendment concerns about this process, as I did on cards. It's not the direction we should be going in regulation in this country, and I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Ohio, Ms. Beatty, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to Ranking Member Green. Let me first say thank you to the panelists for being here, and that I'm also proud to associate myself with the comments from my ranking member of Financial Services, Congresswoman Maxine. Mr. Chairman, and to the witnesses today, certainly this is an important topic. When I received my overview with the name of the topic today that we were going to look at consumer protection and data security, it kind of puzzles me as we have witnesses here that we don't have anyone here that's actually from the agency that we're talking about, and that we have certainly discussed, which probably are important for us to hear our different views from our witnesses that go far beyond what I think we should be discussing at hand. We're talking about the establishment and how it was established 5 years ago. We're talking about the budget. We're talking about everything but the real issue of what this hearing was scheduled to do, which I think is unfortunate and a disservice to me and to our constituents. I'd also be curious to your expertise, starting with you, former Mr. Speaker. Can you tell us your expertise as a cybersecurity expert? I know that you're here as yourself, as you commented. I also know that you are a paid public affairs consultant with the WISE group. So tell me what your expertise is in this area.
Well, I wouldn't classify it as expertise, but I have worked on data issues and on cyber issues for over 25 years. As Speaker of the House, I had a substantial amount of involvement. I've this year spent time out at the National Security Agency looking at their things. I served for 6 years on the Defense Policy Board, and cyber was part of that. And I can tell you, as a historian, all you have to do is clip out of the newspapers the increasing frequency of cyber activities, the increasing frequency of hacking, and the stunning inability of the American government to protect itself. And I think that doesn't require any massive level of expertise. I do think it would be wise for the subcommittee to arrange for a number of people who have cyber capabilities to come in and explain why this is a dangerous thing. And it's dangerous at two levels. Remember, it's about mass data collection program. Okay, so it's dangerous at two levels. We're talking about breaches and hacking. It's also dangerous because the truth is, in the age of metadata, you can identify individuals from supposedly anonymous information. And you might want to have a hearing and bring in people from places like Carnegie Mellon and MIT and go through this. But I will assure you, I have spent time with the Army Cyber Command. I've spent time at NSA. I am not personally a cyber expert, but I think
thank you. I kind
I'm
of
reasonably
get the gist.
knowledgeable.
I'm going to move on because of my time. So based on that, and you're clipping out articles and reading it in your past experience, let me ask you this. Some have commented that CFPB is particularly vulnerable to hackers because of their heavy reliance on cloud-based computing. Can you tell me how you feel about that and why, and what better practices from your reading and the experience you've said that would be better? Give me something specific.
Well, I think if you talk to people at the Pentagon and at the
No, I mean, in your opinion, not who I should talk about.
Okay.
You're here today.
In my
I want to
opinion-
hear from you, not from
Okay.
who I can call or who the Republicans can bring in. You have shared that you have this experience, and you have probably been the most critical. And so I want to be able to discern and be able to separate, is this predisposed from articles I've clipped out on you and what you have said that's clearly coming with some predetermined ideas against the organization and Mr. Cordray. So let's keep this in the context and give me some specifics that you have. You're sitting here today, not the folks that they may call or may come in the future. So let's hear from you.
Okay, and I would say then three things. One, I believe if you aggregate this kind of data, you always have the potential to identify individuals, and I would be glad to provide you technical experts who will explain that. Two,
So in other words, you don't have any that you can give me. I can call those folks or wait till my colleague to bring in a real expert who's sitting here taking my time up to hear it. Thank you very much. Let me go to the second gentleman. Can you answer that question, please?
Thank you, Congresswoman. Our testimony is focusing on the policymaking process and the problem that you have when you have a single director with nobody that can engage.
No, that's not my question about the single director. I'm sorry, my time is up.
That's what
and
our
I yield
focus
back.
is in our testimony.
Okay, but that wasn't my question to you. So let's be clear on that.
Right.
the gentlelady yields back the turn. I recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Holkman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you all for being here. Speaker Gingrich, good to see you. One of my favorite memories of serving over the last 5 years was being with you and your wife in Tampico and Dixon, Illinois for Ronald Reagan's 100th birthday. So I appreciate you being here. Certainly he's a hero of mine, and I appreciate the work you've done talking about him as well. But I want to get to what I see a very important subject here. I'm troubled by all the stories that we've heard of what happens to consumer financial information when it gets into the wrong hands and how aggressive people are of trying to get this information. Our government should be held to the highest standard when it comes to protecting personal information it holds on the American people. On October 15th, the CFPB released its final rule to expand data collection under Regulation C, the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, or HMDA. The final rule requires covered banks and credit unions to collect 48 unique data fields on each mortgage loan they make. This is more than double the number of data fields covered lenders are currently required to collect. Some of the new fields include applicant or borrower age, credit score, automated underwriting system information, unique loan identifier, property value, application channel, points and fees, borrower paid origination charges, discount points, lender credits, loan term, prepayment penalty, non-amortizing loan features, interest rate, and loan originator identifier. I think we can all agree that this is a lot of information. And while some of this information is not directly related to the borrower or terms of the loan, this data can still be revealing. I understand regulators and the public make use of this data, but I'm also concerned that it could pose privacy risks for homeowners. Speaker Gingrich, if I can direct this first question to you, I think we all remember the Office of Personnel Management data breach, and I think we've heard some testimony today about how the CFPB's data security controls may be inadequate. In light of the incidents like OPM and others within the government, how can we assure the American people that their personal information is safe?
Well, first of all, you can't. Second, you reminded me, I got one of the letters of among 21 million people that said my data had been breached, and it said, gee, if you want to do something, call this number. I couldn't imagine anything useful. I mean, what are they going to do? Say, we don't know exactly who breached it, we don't know exactly where it is, and we don't know exactly how it'll be used. I mean, it's nonsense. Yeah. The fact that you can live through this, you can watch this scale of failure, and then have some other bureaucrat sublimely tell you, oh, we are safe. They don't, my first point is they don't know. If you are not offline, yeah, you are by definition potentially hackable. And the government, this is a major crisis for the whole government. This is not something that I was with John McCain, the chairman of the Armed Services Committee in the Senate, who's very worried that we are not able to innovate rapidly enough inside our bureaucracies to keep up with the private sector evolution worldwide, and it's always worldwide. It's Estonians, it's Romanians, it's Russians, it's Israelis, and so we need to understand the threat. I think that is a significant thing, and I would encourage the committee to get people from places like Carnegie Mellon and MIT. Let's meet everybody's concern about the level of technical expertise, and I think you'll find that they will tell you, you should be afraid, you should not be reassured.
I believe you're right. I just had a briefing this morning with Department of Energy and cybersecurity, and some real concerns, real threats, real experts who are frightened, having nightmares, they talked about, of what could happen, and we see this just as widespread. I'm going to ask a question, just a yes or no question. Speaker Gingrich, Dr. Calabria, and Mr. Abernathy, the CFPB's final rule did not explicitly state which of this new data would be made publicly available. It seems to me a study on the privacy risks and the opportunity for public comment would be appropriate, just as Speaker Gingrich was talking about. Speaker, I think you've already answered. Would you agree that this is a good position? I think you say yes.
Yes.
Mr. Abernathy?
I agree, Congressman. Thank you.
Dr. Calabria?
Yes.
Let me jump back and focus to the doctor and to Mr. Abernathy. Do you have any thoughts on why the CFPB chose to go well beyond the new reporting requirements in Section 1094 of Dodd-Frank? The CFPB loves to say they are data-driven in their policy, but doesn't the increased reporting of this data raise more privacy issues?
That's one of the serious concerns when you look at the more than 24 additional data segments that the Bureau asked for, and yet there really is inadequate discussion as to why they need these data, what they would do with it. We need that kind of public debate before they do the rule rather than afterwards.
I agree. Doctor?
And I would certainly agree with that. Let me say, even before this, from what was publicly available for HMDA, you could link to courthouse records and identify individuals with that data, even with the pre-existing databases.
Yeah, I only have a couple seconds left. This feels like such an overreach at such a risky time. I think it's absolutely the wrong direction to go for CFPB to be doing this, and we need to do more to make sure it doesn't happen. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Utah, Ms. Love, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have to tell you, you have an idea of how dangerously powerful some of these regulatory agencies are before you get here, but I can't tell you how shocked I am in getting here and realizing the casualness where we talk about collecting people's private information. The casualness in saying, it's okay, don't worry about it, we're here to protect you. We know everything, we're bigger minds than you are, and we can handle things for you. It is absolutely shocking to me the amount of power these regulatory agencies have over the American people. I have a couple of questions. As I've gone into learning a little bit more about the CFPB, I have several concerns, but I want to focus, first of all, on some of the data collecting, which raises privacy concerns, and second of all, what is being done with that data. These are the questions, by the way, that's not just coming from me, they're coming from my constituency. So I do this work on behalf of them. We've learned that the way that the CFPB uses data and interprets the data was highly suspect, and that the results, the supposed redress that the CFPB imposed on the marketplace was not correlated with the actual harm. There was a lot of guesswork involved, and the guesswork resulted in the CFPB imposing more requirements on the auto lending market, which results in higher costs and less choices for the consumer. So now, in addition to the auto sales, the CFPB has also been collecting data, as we've heard today, regarding credit reports, credit cards, mortgages, student loans, payday loans, overdraft fees, and other financial data. Over the past year, I've been here in this committee. I've been investigating some of that activity, specifically in regards to payday loans and overdraft fees. So my question for the panelists is, what other CFPB actions do you see on the horizon? What other disappearing options, as you would say, for services that consumers, when they're looking at, need to worry about losing?
If I may, Congresswoman.
Yes.
One of the areas we're particularly concerned about is the ability to serve the market for short-term and small amount loans. Our estimate is that there are 54 million customers each year in the market for small loans, short-term loans. These are loans for less than a year. And the Bureau is on the verge of decreasing significantly the access to those kinds of resources. They have a payday lending rule that they're about to come out with, and estimates are will eliminate 80% of that market in one decision. We're concerned about they're looking at overdraft, where a number of people who have bank accounts use the opportunity to overdraw their account a little bit to be able to obtain immediate short-term credit for a variety of needs, from a vacation to a major emergency that takes place at their home. And yet we've looked at the way they've exposed data on this. One data segment that they put forward indicated that, in their view, the median average overdraft is $24, for which people paid $34. If they actually look at what happens with all of the data for an institution, they discover that the amount of credit that customers receive versus what they pay for it for overdraft is something like 7 to 8 times the amount of the fee. But by manipulating the data in ways that no one can really get at and challenge, they end up promoting policies that could choke off the opportunity for overdrafts to be a source of credit for millions of people.
So far, what I've seen is the people that they have vowed to protect are the ones that are being hurt the most. And I just want to say, because I'm not here to necessarily change the minds of my colleagues, because a lot of the minds have been made up on both sides of the aisle. I'm here to make sure that we're transparent and we give a fair warning, a warning to the American people that if we continue to allow this to happen. The only people that are at risk are the American people. Let me just say right now, this is a fair warning that if we are not vigilant, if we do not cry out, make our voices heard, that this is, first of all, unacceptable. Second of all, we're smart enough to make decisions in our homes and for ourselves. And if we do not do something now, then the only people that are at risk, that have the risk of losing everything, is the American people. And I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Ellison, for 5 minutes. Welcome.
Let me thank the chair and the ranking member, and thank the panel. I really appreciate having time to discuss this issue today. And Mr. Gupta, I'd like to ask you a question, if you may. You made the comment, unless your profits come from deceiving consumers, you should welcome the CFPB's data collection. Could you expand on what you meant by that?
Sure. Thanks for the question. The reason we have the CFPB in the first place is because we had a massive regulatory failure, right? We had a financial crisis that resulted from all sorts of fringe lending that was entirely unchecked. People were asleep at the switch. You didn't have anyone who was looking out for consumer protection. You had the Federal Reserve Board was looking out for other things, and consumer protection took a back seat. And so we created a single agency that's the voice of the American consumer. It's actually standing up for American consumers and trying to prevent the kind of practices. Those practices didn't just harm people who had subprime mortgages, right? They threatened to harm all of us. They threatened to tank the American economy and the world economy. So unless your business model is based on unfair and deceptive practices, the kind of thing that the CFPB pursues in its enforcement actions and its regulations, you should have no concern about transparency and about the CFPB having that data and using it as a tool to do better consumer protection.
Thank you. So honestly, I have to admit something. When I first saw the panel lineup, I thought to myself that my friend Mr. Gingrich, he has a PhD in history, and he may know a lot about that. But what does Newt Gingrich know about big data? I was just a little surprised by that choice. But it turns out that you actually do know a lot about big data, because let me put it like this. Republicans in general claim that they've collected more than 300 terabytes of voter data, including more than 725 billion data points on nearly 200 million American voters. This information is matched to individuals in voter data file, which also contains personally identifiable information, home address, phone number, email. Not only are Republicans collecting massive amounts of voter data, some Republicans even rent out the data to other campaigns. Well, they rent that data to a list of brokers that lease data to marketing firms and other private entities. For example, presidential campaign for Newt Gingrich, 2012, reported getting $17,000 in the most recent FEC reporting cycle, even though that campaign dropped out of the primary more than 3 months before. A separate company, Gingrich Productions, also uses a list broker to sell personal information via TMA Direct. For the low price of $120 a month, you can get access to nearly 500,000 individuals' personal information who were never before on the market. So I did have my doubts about whether our panel was qualified to offer opinions on such a complex topic, but clearly, Speaker Gingrich, you do know something about making money off big data. So I guess my question is, if it's okay for you to sell big data with personal information, why can't the CFPB rely on anonymous data to protect consumers?
Look, that's a great question. It was as often with you, it was a brilliant setup. It is true that we have carefully studied the 2008 and 2012 Obama campaigns. And it's true that while we're still behind them in gathering metadata, and while we don't have quite the ties they have in Silicon Valley and at major intellectual centers, we are doing everything we can on the Republican side to be at least as good as the Obama team at using metadata. So I think I appreciate your recognizing that while we're second, we're working hard to catch up. Second, the big difference, and you put your finger on it, I can't go to somebody and threaten to cut off their bank loans. I can't go to somebody and threaten to put them in jail. People who happen to be on my list voluntarily signed up to get information from Newt Gingrich and can voluntarily get off the list without having a bureaucrat call and threaten them. If you look at the power of the government, which is always in the end coercion, and you imagine random independent bureaucrats who arrogate to themselves the right to decide what my consumer choices should be, that's real power. We don't have real power. We're just a private company doing private things in a free market, and that's why I am so frightened to see this much power in the government.
And make it a good penny at personal data. Thank you, Mr. Gingrich.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Green from Texas, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me start with a few questions, and I'd like for you to raise your hands if these questions apply to you. If you are in any way now or ever connected to the U.S. Consumer Coalition, would you kindly raise your hand? Let the record reflect that Mr. Gingrich has raised his hand. If you are now or you have ever been paid by the WISE group, if you would raise your hand, the WISE Public Affairs Group. Thank you. And Mr. Gingrich, since you've raised your hands both times, I'd like to know a little bit more about the WISE Public Affairs Group. But before I get there, I want to go back to something that you and I have broached earlier, and that has to do with your statement. Because in your statement, you do indicate that you are an advisor, an advisory capacity. But I was hoping that you would do what was done when the Wall Street Journal had to issue its additional statement, and that is indicate that you were a paid advisor to the WISE Public Affairs Group, because you well know that the WISE Public Affairs Group owns and operates the U.S. Consumer Coalition. So I was disappointed that this was not called to our attention. As has been indicated, this is not the first time this has been done. You pride yourself in transparency, but for some reason, you didn't reveal this money connection. You were willing to reveal that you just happened to advise, but you're making a profit based upon this advice because you work for the WISE group. If I have misstated this about your working for the WISE Public Affairs Group and also being connected to the U.S. Consumer Coalition, would you kindly raise your hand again, because I'd like to hear from you if you have not misstated it. Let the record reflect that what I've said per Mr. Gingrich is accurate. And this is why we bring this up, Mr. Gingrich, because this U.S. coalition, Consumer Coalition, is out to emasculate the CFPB. It has published its intent in terms of what it would like to do to the CFPB. There are many of us who are of the opinion that the CFPB serves a meaningful purpose. And we are of the opinion that in serving this meaningful purpose, the CFPB has done a good thing. The CFPB makes it possible for consumers to receive restitution after they have been harmed. And it is unfortunate, but I think it's fair to say that if the rule that you would have us adhere to were implemented, then there are many consumers who would not receive the benefits that they have received already. The personally identifiable information of which we speak is not by law permitted to be used for market monitoring. Not by law, it can't be used. But it can be used for enforcement activities, which means you find out that a consumer has been harmed, you can take that personal identifiable information and you can then contact that consumer and say, you have been harmed, as was done with the $4.5 billion in relief that was given in debt collection, $50 million of it in civil penalties, I might add, $2 billion to consumers related to credit card enforcement, $140 million for civil penalties. $125 million to consumers for auto finance enforcement. Defrauded, taken advantage of, $25 million of it in related civil penalties. $115 million in relief to mortgage lending, for mortgage lending enforcement. $55 million of that in civil penalties. $20 million in relief to consumers for student lending enforcement. $2 million related to civil monetary penalties. $19 million to consumers for payday enforcement activities. Over $10 million in related civil monetary penalties. So if we decide that we are no longer going to allow the CFPB to aggregate information for enforcement purposes, we now take away these dollars that are going to consumers because we won't be able to find out who they are and contact them. I suppose there's some nebulous way that someone would conclude that we can do this, but the truth of the matter is enforcement activities benefit seniors. The CFPB is in the business of helping people, and this would eviscerate it to the extent that it would be emasculated, if not eviscerated, such that it could not continue its enforcement activities and return monies to seniors who have been harmed. Seniors, citizens is a more appropriate term, consumers. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes. Now, taking a page from the ranking member, would the panel, would you raise your hand if you are surprised that former Speaker Newt Gingrich is fighting for limited government and more transparency in government? If you're surprised by that, raise your hand. Mr. Gupta, you're not surprised by that. It's consistent with everything this man has done.
No, I am surprised that he's paid by the financial industry.
Well, you're not, no, that was my question. You're not surprised that he's fighting for limited government and more transparency? What I find unique is my friends across the aisle want to do everything to attack the former speaker when this is consistent with his life's work. And we're talking about big data and an abuse of power. And I commend the speaker for coming in and lending his voice to this very important issue. Now, question to the panel. Do you all agree that American consumers are at risk of having their data taken from the collection at the CFPB?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Calabria?
Yes.
Mr. Gingrich? Yes. Mr. Gupta, do you agree with that?
I would say, of course, there's a risk, but no more than with any other agency, and less so with the private sector.
Mr. Gupta, is there another agency out there that goes by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau? Anyone?
No.
Yes or no?
No.
So the one that's here to protect consumers is also an agency that's putting consumers at risk with the data that they collect, right?
No.
Yes or no?
No, I mean, you
just told me that they were...
It's just a false construct. Because
no, it's not a false... Listen.
The risk in the private sector for this data is far greater than it is with the CFPB.
So,
and
I'm going to reclaim my time.
What the CFPB is no different from other regulators.
The speaker pointed out there's a big difference between the private sector and big government. If I choose to go get a license at the DMV, it's government, they have my information, I know that. If I shop at Target or Home Depot, they have my information and I know it. Does the American consumer actually know that the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is collecting their information? Do you think they know that? Dr. Calabria?
I don't believe they do.
Okay, Mr. Abernathy, by chance does the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, do they ask the people that they claim to protect if they can collect their personal information?
No, they go to the institutions with which people have voluntarily entered into a business relationship and then gather up all of that data and bring it into the Bureau.
So they don't ask them, do they?
They don't.
The very people they claim to protect, they don't ask for the data, and they put those very people they claim to protect at risk by housing the data. Dr. Calabria?
If I could also mention, I mean, I guess I should be careful as a non-lawyer, but I remind the committee that the Fourth Amendment does not apply to the private sector. You can choose. What the Fourth Amendment does is constrain the government, and that's what we should not lose sight of here.
I think that's a very good point. Another concern that I have, I think, Mr. Gupta, you made the point that this agency is better. It's better because it's not subject to, I think you said, lobbying and outside forces. They can do the goodwill of the people without being subject to the people. Is that basically your point?
No, I mean, all agencies should be held accountable, and the CFPB is accountable. We've had countless hearings about that.
I chair the Oversight Committee. We've asked for countless documents specifically on this, and if they don't turn them over to us, do you think that they're accountable?
I do. I mean, you know,
So if they don't give me all the documents,
if there's another agency that's had to come up to the Hill and testify more than the CFPB over the past couple of years, I'm not aware of it.
so on that point, maybe, Mr. Gingrich, would the model be better then if the EPA, the DOJ, the Health and Human Services, the Department of Education, all weren't subject to appropriations? They would just come and give us a few lip service hearings a couple times a year. Would the democracy be better off if we followed Mr. Gupta's set of ideas?
I understand why people who want to coerce and control the American people want to ensure that the Congress can't represent people in an effective way. I mean, I think that, if you think about it, the logic of that's perfect. But I want to go back to something that your ranking member said that I'm confused by. If, in fact, the CFPB doesn't know about individuals, how did all that money get back out to individuals? And how do we know it got to the right individuals? And isn't it a case that, in fact, I am told that in the auto loan problem, they were actually ending up paying white Americans for racial discrimination because, in fact, their algorithms were wrong. So you can't have it both ways. It's either, you know, the idea of trying to stop 2007 and 2008 makes some limited sense, although the problems weren't bureaucratic, they were judgment. But the idea that we leap from that, which would be a focus on the big banks, to deciding that we're going to look at everything anybody does in America based on the whim of one bureaucrat in a hidden institution, which is remarkably secret, to go back to that term,
And
I think is just wrong.
My time is up, but pursuant to Clause 4D of the committee's Rule 3, the chair recognizes himself for an additional 5 minutes, and I'll also then recognize the ranking member after I'm done for an additional 5 minutes. To that point, Speaker Gingrich, I would agree with you. Personally identifiable information is taken by the CFPB, contrary to Mr. Gupta's prior testimony. You would now agree, Mr. Gupta, that the CFPB does collect personally identifiable information, correct?
I think a lot of things are being conflated here. You have to be clear. The ongoing data collection that is being talked about
I'm going to reclaim my time. These are very specific questions. I'm going to reclaim my time.
Information.
Does the very simple question, does the CFPB collect personally identifiable information?
Not as part of the ongoing market monitoring. The only extent...
So I'm going to translate that for the American people. The answer is yes.
Only through the consumer complaint database and through the supervision process. Those are the only ways in which any personally identifiable information comes in, and it's scrubbed before it's used by the Bureau.
By which you indicate they collect. They do collect. And GAO in their study said under arbitration cases, they collect personally identifiable information. Deposit advance products, they collect personally identifiable information. And Starfront payday loans, they collected personally identifiable information. So they do collect it, and they do put the American consumer at risk. That's when they have the information, and that's not even talking about how we can reverse engineer the data points that they do have.
Mr. Chairman, if I may,
to subject the American people to cyber attacks.
Those three examples were the only ones that they found. The arbitration study was mandated by Congress. There's no other way to do it if you don't get the arbitration cases.
I'm going to reclaim my time. That's very different than what you tried to first say to this committee, which was that it wasn't collected, and to now your clarified statement, it is collected. Dr.
No, what I said was that none of the ongoing market monitoring elections include personal information.
I just wanted to make two quick points. One was on the notion of oversight. If we said that somehow J.P. Morgan, that Jamie Dimon is responsible to J.P. Morgan because he appeared in front of his board twice a year, we would think that was ridiculous. If we said that he was accountable because he appeared before his regulator twice a year, we would say that's ridiculous. So the notion that hearings are somehow what constitutes accountability and that's sufficient for an agency, I think that's, all due respect, absurd. But more importantly, I want to get to the notion of we had a financial crisis. It was painful. Everybody agrees with that. Mr. Gupta lists in his testimony a number of things on the first page of the CFP has done. Not a one was the cause of the financial crisis. In fact, when the CFPB had an opportunity to deal with the cause of the financial crisis in its qualified mortgage rule, it punted. It gave up on checking credit. It gave up on down payments. Congressman Frank sat before at this dais a year and a half ago and said that the most important part of Dodd-Frank, the mortgage rules, were essentially gutted. So essentially, if we want this agency to actually do something about the financial crisis, we have to recognize the financial crisis was not caused by payday lending. It was not caused by arbitration clauses. It was caused by shoddy mortgages. And again, in that instance, the CFPB completely punted.
From the GSEs?
Yes, again, for the
Was there reform
GSEs
for
are
the
exempt. FHA is exempt. We've basically said anybody who had anything to do with the crisis, with the exception of mortgage brokers, is exempt from the CFPB. So let's not pretend that this agency has almost even a loose connection to the financial crisis.
I find it hard to wrap my head around the fact that if you're accountable to the American people by way of the Congress and through appropriations, if you disclose not just the data that you collect, but the purpose for that data, what are you using it? Now, the NSA has been very clear on the parameters in which they use the data points that they collected on phone records. Tell me if you disagree, that the CFPB has not set out bright guidelines for how this data is going to be used. They've told us a few of the things that it'll be used for, but Mr. Abernathy, would you agree that they haven't been clear on how and the limitations in which this data can be used?
That's one of the most significant concerns we have, is that they gather in enormous amounts of information, keep the data in-house, and then they parse out only the pieces of it that will establish the positions that they've already taken. It's like being in a court case where the prosecutor says, here's the information I'm going to share, which shows that you're guilty, but you don't have access to the other information I have that might tell a different story.
Thank you. And I'm going to go to Mr. Gingrich, Speaker Gingrich, for one quick second before my time expires. The CFPB, whether you like it or not, has been empowered to make rules. And I want to make sure that the rules that they make are good rules, that they actually help the American consumer and they help the American people. But Mr. Gingrich, do you think that they could obtain good data by way of sampling as opposed to bulk data collection? I know that you and campaigns have looked at a lot of polling data that's pretty representative of the country as a whole. Could we have the same impact if we were sampling as opposed to long-term bulk data collection?
Well, look, I think it depends on what you're trying to accomplish. If what they want to know is, are there patterns that should be looked at, you could do all that by polling. But what you're seeing, if you just think about the logic of what they're now doing, what you're seeing is an effort to assimilate all of the consumer behavior of the United States into one analyzable system for the purpose of a group of bureaucrats making a decision about whether or not it is an acceptable behavior. Now, that's a very practical thing if you're in their shoes. They would like to have the entire economy at their fingertips so they have control, so they can decide which parts of the economy are inappropriate. I think that's really, really dangerous.
And my time has expired. I now recognize for an additional 5 minutes the ranking member, Mr. Green.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let's go to you, Mr. Gupta. Mr. Gupta, would you make the distinction between market monitoring and the supervisory activities with reference to enforcement?
Yes. Yeah. You'd like me to elaborate on that?
Well, is the CFPB allowed to collect identifiable information for market monitoring?
It's not. The Dodd-Frank Act makes that illegal, and the GAO found that the CFPB is obeying the law.
And if someone has information to the contrary, if you have information indicating that the CFPB is collecting identifiable information for the purpose of market monitoring, would you kindly raise your hand? All right, Mr. Abernathy?
One of our concerns is that we don't know what the Bureau is collecting
But you
and what
don't
they're
know.
using it for.
My question to you is, do you have any evidence of it actually happening?
No one in America
You don't have any evidence of it. So you will now use conjecture and speculation to, in some way, skew this issue such that people would be confused. That's what this hearing is all about, confusing the American people so that they will now want to end the CFPB that happens to be a benefit to them. And Mr. Gingrich has gone so far as to say in his testimony that it is imperative that we move toward abolishing the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, abolishing it, which, by the way, is the same desire of some of these entities that he works for. It is important for the American people to know who's working on their behalf. And you can confuse the American people with enough of this rhetoric that we've heard today, and they'll be absolutely opposed to an entity that benefits them, has sent back all of this money to them, some $11 billion in relief to consumers. This would all be evaporated. It would just go away. They wouldn't have an opportunity to get the money back that they overpaid or the money that they suffered a loss by reference with reference to some kind of fraud or scam, they would just be scammed. They would be defrauded. The personally identifiable information is used so that we can send the money to people. Mr. Gupta, do you agree with this?
I agree wholeheartedly.
And also, we might add that as we go through this process, it is very interesting that there seems to be a sort of a stealth campaign that's taking place under the radar. Entities that can't be properly identified. You don't know who's on the board of directors if there is a board of directors. Massive amounts of money going to a 501c3. Entity indicates that it's going to spend over $1 million to take out certain members of Congress. All of these things are happening just to make sure that the CFPB is emasculated and eviscerated if possible. This is unbelievable. I agree with the ranking member. It's hard for me to get my mind around some of the things that are going on here. The people of this country are absolutely being fed bad information. Yes, they are intelligent. Yes, they are smart. Yes, they can sift the sand and find pearls of information, but they can't do it if you're getting bad information. And that's what this is all about, which is why we have put so much emphasis on what has happened with reference to this stealth organization, this mystery organization. And to this end, I'd like to correct one thing. I said 501c3, and it's a 501c4 organization. And there's so much more to be said. But I do want to add into the record a news article styled Gingrich Connected PR Firm Issues Baffling Response to WSJ Disclosure Failure. And this is where the amplification had to take place. And I would also want to note that in this Mother Jones article, there is an indication that the WISE Public Affairs Group set up this coalition, this consumer coalition, so-called consumer coalition, and that the members of the staff seem to double as members of the coalition. Does anybody know of any board of directors, any member of a board of directors associated with this coalition? If you know of a board member, raise your hand. No one seems to. It's a mystery. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. And I believe that concludes all the witnesses that we had appear for this hearing. I want to thank our witnesses for their testimony in the rigorous debate that took place today. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses. I ask our witnesses to please respond promptly to those requests. Without objection, this hearing is now adjourned.